All right, so our last system of the body is reproductive system. And so with this system, compared to all of our other systems throughout 201 and 202, this one has the least to do with homeostasis. So all the other ones, we're looking at particular factors that those systems are monitoring, are helping to nudge up, nudge down, keep around a set point. But this one is more about creating new individuals rather than maintaining the individual. So when we look at it, to be sure, this system is a little bit more complex where we've got two different versions of the system as opposed to just one. So that's something that we need to contend with and keep in mind. We want to do comparisons between male and female reproductive systems. So some of their structures and functions are going to be very similar. Some of them are going to be very different, especially when we get into what's called gametogenesis, when we're talking about the creation of the gametes. It's very different between the two. So in terms of similarities, to be sure, we have our primary sex organs, which are going to be either the testes or the ovaries. And remember that the gonads here are going to be the primary sex organs because without them, reproduction cannot occur, right? This is where the gametes are created. All of the other organs that we'll talk about, the glands, the tubes, the other organs, are just there to support or transport the gametes in some particular way. Now, assuredly, most of the reproductive function that we have is coming from the system, right? But there is also some endocrine function that's coming from the system as well. Now, interestingly, the hormones that are produced by the system, most of them have an effect on this same system, coordinating between different organs of the reproductive system or communicating between the brain and the reproductive organs or back and forth. They do have some overall kind of metabolic effects or secondary effects, but this is where we will also talk about those sex hormones, where we kind of glossed over them a bit in the endocrine system. Okay, so we start a little bit simply when we're going for the male reproductive system because overall, like we said, both systems, male and female, are producing gametes, producing sex hormones, transporting and supporting those gametes, but female reproductive system is going to be the one that actually supports the developing embryo, then fetus, etc. So we will have a section on development that you will be learning about as well. With that section though, it certainly, as usual, would be a benefit to read the chapter or a chapter in whatever book you have. But for that, in terms of development, really what you need to know, we'll cover it in the lecture itself. So don't worry about reading a whole bunch of extra detail about that. Okay, so in any case, male reproductive system, this is our typical mid-sagittal cut. So this is what you've been learning in the lab, the anatomical parts, and then you need to know a function for each of them. So pretty standard type of introduction to the system. Again, our primary sex organs, the testes down here, all of the rest of these have some sort of assisting function instead. So you go through the exam objectives, you'll find that as with digestive system, urinary system, a lot of these tubular systems, going through and doing a tracing and actually being able to picture in your mind or out on paper or on your computer how these sex cells are moving through the system, just like digestive system, is going to be beneficial on how these different parts relate to one another. Okay, so like we said, you aren't going to need to know all the different parts and what they do, but we spend a lot of time down at the gonad level because that's where our sex cells are going to be created. So what you're seeing here is the inside of all of these tubules that exist inside of the testes. So in a way, the testes are a little bit like the kidneys, where we have all these really small tubules winding back and forth throughout it, which gives us a lot of surface area. Same kind of importance in terms of the kidneys with those nephrons, where we needed a lot of surface area to be able to create urine. Now we need a lot of surface area to be able to create our sperm cells. And so this is one part of it. If we were to imagine, right, there would be a big seminiferous tubule, sorry, I'm going off screen there, that continues around in a big circle. I apologize for my drawing. And then there'd be like a lumen. Ooh, that's a very interesting lumen down there. So this is the wall of the seminiferous tubule. And so what we see is towards the outer part of the wall, we have these immature or developing sperm cells that we call spermatogonia. And as we progress towards the inside, we see that there are going to be meiotic divisions going on. You can see how there is meiosis 1 stages occurring and meiosis 2 stages occurring. So at the end of this process, through those 2 steps of cell division, we end up with, in this case, 4 different sex cells, of which we call spermatids, which ultimately become what are called spermatozoa that are released into the lumen. So not only are there going to be developing sex cells through here, but there are going to be a kind of a base level of stem cells that are going to be maintained out here through mitotic division instead of meiotic division. Right? Mitotic division is kind of like xeroxing. Meiotic division is more like tearing in half, if you will. But there's also going to be a number of what are called sustentacular or nurse cells here too. And you see all this yellow material all surrounding it and helping to hold these different developmental stages of sperm in place. These are the nurse cells or the sustentacular cells. So they also, on a cellular level, are assisting in terms of this case of sperm development. This is also the site of reception of the hormone testosterone in terms of its message to get through to produce more sex cells. But in any case, you do need to know kind of where is meiosis 1 occurring and where is meiosis 2 occurring in these different stages that we see here, and that ultimately we end up with 4 specialized haploid cells. Each one only has half of the genetic material, right? We're starting out with diploid cells that you see here, 2N, and through those meiotic divisions, we're ending up with 4 haploid cells. And that's important because we put out millions and millions and millions and millions of cells even within a single ejaculation, and so it's important that we can make lots and lots of these cells throughout the reproductive lifetime of the male, which is decades and decades. So this, kind of multiplication, if you will, in terms of meiotic division is very important. Okay, so like we usually do, we also talk about the control and coordination of this system, and so we get into some of the hormones that we mentioned before, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and you can see their effects as they go down and have target tissues that are within the testes themselves. So follicle stimulating hormone, this is actually stimulating more gametes to be produced. Luteinizing hormone is stimulating these what are called interstitial cells, those that are in between the seminiferous tubules, and telling them to secrete testosterone. Okay, and then we talk about some of the metabolic effects, the other types of effects of testosterone, etc. Now, when we get to female reproductive anatomy, same type of mid-sagittal cut, we need to know all of these different parts and what they do. You want to be able to trace a pathway of when we release a gamete from the ovary, from the gonad itself, where is it going to pass through? It's going to get picked up by the fimbriae and go through the ampulla and then the main channel of the uterine tube, heading to the uterus, different sections of the uterus, down to the isthmus, the narrow part, leading down to the cervix, and ultimately out the vagina. Notice, right, we're seeing some similarities and some differences between the male and female reproductive anatomy. There is erectile organs and erectile tissues in both male and female anatomy. So there are similarities, but there are differences, right? In the male reproductive system, we saw a shared pathway of the urethra transporting urine as well as sperm, and in the female, we see 2 distinct passageways instead. This is our frontal view, again showing the relationship of some of these organs and tubes, etc. And this is going to be a key thing that we need to know in the female reproductive system, is we need to know exactly what's going on in these gonads and the primary sex organs, but we also have this uterus, I was going to say kind of U or V-shaped uterus here, that is very, very important in terms of preparing for pregnancy. So both the ovary and the uterus are going to go through cycles that allow them to each month prepare for a potential pregnancy. So they have to be coordinated, and they're going to go through changes associated, and they're going to be communicating with each other in order to coordinate those two. So like you saw in the ovarian cycle and the ovarian stages that we saw in the lab, we're going to see that when we're looking at the production of gametes in the female, it's much different than in the male. So we're starting out with what are called primordial follicles that are stored in the ovary. They're produced before you're born, and they're released generally one at a time throughout the reproductive lifetime of the female. And a handful of them on a monthly basis will be stimulated via hormones to develop into other later stages and ultimately, possibly, if they win this developmental race, be what's called the follicle that will ovulate the egg. So we have primordial ones that develop into primary ones that you see here. Primary ones go to secondary ones with multiple layers of cells around them and this fluid-filled antrum. And then the secondary ones, end up, for a human at least, one a month is going to develop into a Graafian or mature follicle. And that's the one that's going to release the egg or oocyte. Now these follicular cells, which were just surrounding the egg previously, have a job to do even when the egg is released. In fact, those follicular cells become what's called a corpus luteum. And a corpus luteum is actually an endocrine structure that releases primarily progesterone to communicate to the uterus, letting it know that the egg has been released and is on the way down to it. So it needs to prepare. Now, of course, as we're going through the reproductive structures of the male and the female, for the female, we have the mammary glands as well as an accessory structure. Again, not for production of gametes or anything like that, but for supporting the baby after it's born. So you need to know the structure of that. And then we get into the details, like we mentioned, of oogenesis. This process, which on a certain level looks the same, where we see meiotic divisions occurring and then gametes being produced. But notice at the end of this process, what we actually have is only one mature egg or ovum that is released. In the male spermatogenesis, we started out with a spermatogonium. You see the stem cell has this gonium suffix. We started out with a spermatogonium and we ended up with 4 mature sperm cells. In this case, we start out with 1 oogonium and we end up with only 1 viable egg or ovum. So that's an important difference, as well as the timing of it, like we said, that takes place over decades and decades, as opposed to kind of an on-demand system for the male reproductive system. Male reproductive system, from the time we have the spermatogonium until a sperm is mature and stored in the epididymis, we're talking maybe 2 months or something like that. Okay, so knowing those comparisons of what we would call gametogenesis in the male and the female is a big important topic, to be sure. Like we said, another big important topic is the ovarian cycle as well as the uterine cycle. So you need to know the 3 phases of the ovarian and the uterine cycle, what we call the follicular phase, like we see where the follicle is growing, ovulation, where the egg is being released, and then the luteal phase, when the corpus luteum comes into being. We also then need to know the uterine cycle, the menstrual phase, menstruation, the proliferative phase, and then the secretory phase, and what's going on in the uterus during those phases. Each and every month, that uterus, as long as you're not pregnant or something else is going on, each and every month, the uterus is preparing its fertile ground, if you will, the endometrium, for the potential arrival of what's called a blastocyst, or basically the early embryo. And if that doesn't happen, then just like, the fertile ground on a farm or whatever, we're going to plow that field, we're going to get rid of that endometrium, and we're going to grow it up again, we're going to plant again, potentially, etc. So, menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and secretory phase. You need to know kind of what causes each of those. And so that's going to be something, as you are going through this, that you need to look over in a step-by-step process. The fact that when we're talking about the ovarian phases, we have our 2 gonadotropins that coordinate what's going on in the ovary. Luteinizing hormone, right, causes the creation of the luteum, the corpus luteum, and causes ovulation, because we got to kick that egg out before we can form the corpus luteum. Follicle stimulating hormone has a very straightforward name, which causes those follicles to develop: primordial, primary, secondary, tertiary, or mature. The estrogens and the progesterone that the ovary put out, those are chemical messengers that go down to the uterus. So you need to know how the estrogens and the progesterone work to coordinate those 3 different uterine cycles as well. And that's what we see here. So here are 3 phases of the ovarian cycle. So you need to know which of these 3 phases is coordinated by which of those two hormones coming down. Same thing here. 1, 2, 3 phases that are controlled by two different hormones coming from the ovary. So there's going to be some doubling up there in those coordination of those phases when we have two hormones, but yet 3 phases in both cases. So that's an important topic to be sure. All right, so that should do it in terms of reproductive system. Like we said, there is some development that goes along the way too, where we talk about the early embryonic phases as well as the embryonic and then fetal phases, and what's going on as well as birth. And so limit yourself to those topics as to what we mentioned in the lecture itself. So don't bother reading the additional chapter on it, etc. We'll just touch on some of those steps that finish up this process in creating a new individual instead. Okay? Alrighty, there you go.